Hey guys, it's towniesimbuilds here, and welcome back to another episode of Sims 4 Real Lore. In this series, we dive into fascinating destinations from around the world, shrouded in history, mystery, and oftentimes quite a bit of spookiness. In today's episode, we explore one of the strangest events in France's history, the Moberly Jourdain Incident, which took place in the royal Versailles gardens of the late Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI. Between a series of ghostly apparitions, disappearing structures, and theories of time travel, what exactly happened in August of 1901? Before diving into today's episode, I do want to note that this video will cover topics regarding the supernatural and paranormal, so please keep that in mind while watching. On another note, I am not versed in French and some of the other languages mentioned in this episode. However, I will do my best to pronounce these different names for you guys. Beginning our tale today, a woman by the name of Charlotte Ann Moberly was born in the year 1846 in Winchester, England. Born to a large family of 15 children, Charlotte's father served as a vicar and headmaster of the nearby Winchester College. As a brief overview, Charlotte was raised in a highly conservative religious family, and was said to be a highly studious and intellectual individual even in her youth. Eventually, Charlotte Moberly would follow in her father's footsteps, eventually becoming the principal of an all-girls school in 1886, at the approximate age of 40. Originally, the school, known as St. Hugh's Hall, held only 4 students. However, enrollment would grow to more than 60 students by the time Charlotte would retire in the year 1915. However, during her time as a principal of St. Hugh's Hall, Charlotte would embark on a life-changing trip in the year 1901. While the exact reasons for the trip are unknown, Charlotte would travel overseas on a visit to France. Joining Charlotte on her trip was a younger assistant by the name of Eleanor Jourdain, who was approximately 37 years old at this time. During their trip to France, both Charlotte and Eleanor would take a tour of the Grand Palace of Versailles. The sprawling estate and vast gardens, also the former home of the French monarchy, was now open to the public. Unfortunately, there are conflicting accounts of what happened that day. However, most sources state that Charlotte and Eleanor were following a tour guide throughout the palace. At some point during the tour, the two women would decide to depart from their group. Some sources claim that the two women had become lost while on the tour, while others state that the two women had become restless and wanted to explore the palace on their own. This would eventually lead them to the Versailles Gardens, and a building known as the Petit Trianon. Roughly, this translates to Little Villa, and was a smaller estate gifted by King Louis XVI to his wife Marie Antoinette. It is at this point, however, that Charlotte and Eleanor would experience a very strange occurrence that would impact the rest of their lives. While in the royal gardens, Charlotte and Eleanor would encounter an abandoned farmhouse. This was likely a part of the Queen's Hamlet, a section of the garden that was fabricated into a pseudo-provincial village, used for Marie Antoinette's leisure and entertainment. From a window in a nearby cottage, Charlotte and Eleanor noticed a woman shaking a white cloth. Not far from her, Eleanor would then see a woman and a young girl standing together in a doorway, located in another cottage. Both were dressed in long white cloth dresses, with the woman wearing a large white kerchief tucked into her bodice. Eerily, however, Eleanor found their appearances to be very disconcerting, comparing their still, unnerving presences to those of wax figures. After this odd sight, the two women would eventually encounter 2 men farther along the path, which they presumed to be gardeners at the palace. However, their garments felt out of place. Charlotte describes the gardeners' appearances as, quote, dignified officials, dressed in long grayish coats with 3 cornered hats. Despite their strange clothing, Charlotte and Eleanor asked for directions from the 2 men, who pointed them towards a path within the garden. The 2 women proceeded further into the palace grounds, but were suddenly met with an overwhelming sensation, one that affected Charlotte even more so, according to some reports. Inexplicably, they seemed to be engulfed in a wave of oppression and distress, a feeling that would only worsen as more eerie encounters would soon rise. Among these encounters was a strange, silent man sitting beside a small, Chinese-style kiosk, a gazebo-like structure situated on the property. The man reportedly had a dark complexion, with what appeared to be several small scars throughout his face. Upon coming into eye contact with him, the 2 women were immediately frightened by his glare, claiming that a man had a sinister look to his eyes. Shortly following their meeting with this man, some sources state that the 2 women would encounter a mysterious, curly-haired man. The man spoke in an unknown language they could not understand, but, from his gestures, he appeared to hastily gesture them away to another area of the garden. At this point in their bizarre experience, both Charlotte and Eleanor would encounter one final individual within the gardens of Versailles. Following the path away from the Chinese gazebo, they would see a strange, long-haired woman wearing a light, old-fashioned dress and a white hat, both of which being very out of place for the current time period. Based on their claims, the woman appeared to be sitting on the grass sketching a picture. Most notably, the woman was also situated directly in front of the Petit Trianon. Upon viewing the woman, Charlotte claimed to feel uncomfortably oppressed in her presence. Following this encounter, the two women eventually found their way back to the tour group. However, their experiences in the gardens surrounding the Petit Trianon left them with an uneasiness they were unable to ignore. Departing France, Charlotte and Eleanor did not speak about their unsettling encounters at Versailles. However, about a week later, Charlotte would write a letter to her sister, sharing her experience. Eventually, Charlotte and Eleanor would convene not long after their return. Based on reports, Charlotte asked her assistant Eleanor, "Do you think the Petit Trianon is haunted?" To which Eleanor firmly replied, yes. In order to test the validity of their accounts, both Charlotte and Eleanor agreed to write separate recollections of the experiences they shared at Versailles. Startlingly, the two women found that their accounts held several glaring similarities. Upon doing further research into the history surrounding Versailles and its gardens, Charlotte and Eleanor were able to identify some of the mysterious individuals they encountered in August of 1901. Most notably, Charlotte recognized the woman sketching at the Petit Trianon. Reviewing an oil portrait by painter 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗖𝗛𝗡𝗏, she was surprised to find that the apparition was no ordinary noble. With the same white hat, white dress, and overall physical appearance she recalled from her visit, Charlotte identified the woman as none other than Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France prior to the Revolution. As a brief overview, Marie Antoinette was originally born in Vienna, Austria, in the year 1755. Daughter to the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa, she was forced to leave her home country at approximately 15 years of age. This stemmed from a political alliance France and Austria struggled to re-establish, with Marie Antoinette promised in marriage to the future successor of the French throne, King Louis XVI. Unfortunately, both her marriage to King Louis and her ascension to queendom proved difficult in many aspects. Her initial incompatibility with the king was challenging, with the couple unable to produce an heir for a period of about 7 to 8 years. Furthermore, Marie struggled with her royal duties, finding it hard to adapt to many of Versailles' royal customs and procedures. In regards to political matters, her efforts also proved to be unsuccessful, and were often met with much skepticism from the royal court. Despite the shortcomings of her new life at Versailles, Marie was noted to be an outgoing young woman, with a love for fashion, parties, gambling, and leisure with fellow royalty. The Petit Trianon proved to be a popular location for Marie, who accommodated aristocratic friends with space for entertainment, dining, and lodging. However, while Marie, the king, and the ruling upper classes enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, the kindling of a major uprising would soon come to fruition. Millions of French residents belonging to the poorest of the social classes, also known as the Third Estate, grew angered as unemployment, poverty, and famine plagued an alleged 90% of the French population. Multiple attempts were made by the Third Estate to receive aid and political representation from the First and Second Estates, which were comprised of wealthier and more influential French citizens. Most notably, the Third Estate pushed firmly for a new French constitution to progress their efforts. However, their initiative was struck down by King Louis, Queen Marie Antoinette, and other members of the opposing First and Second Estates, who proved unrelenting. With a lack of action from the upper classes and an inability to make waves in a corrupt government, the Third Estate would mobilize in the year 1789 and launch the beginnings of the French Revolution. Although there were thousands of deaths during what was known as France's Reign of Terror, both Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI were the most prominent victims of the revolution. All but one of the couple's 4 biological children perished, with Marie Antoinette's daughter, Marie-Thérèse, being a sole survivor. Marie-Thérèse eventually would return to Austria years later in 1796. King Louis XVI was first to be executed in January 21st of 1793, while Queen Marie Antoinette's execution would occur later that year on October 16th. Overall, these events would mark a violent and tumultuous end to France's monarchy. Beyond death, Marie Antoinette has continued to be a controversial figure recognized throughout the world, serving as a symbol of greed, excessiveness, and corruption. Despite being generally well-liked in the early stages of her queendom, Marie's extravagant spending and exorbitant lifestyle earned her the nickname Madame de Facite. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," is often miscredited to Marie Antoinette as a display of her ignorance, particularly to the starvation and poor living conditions of France's third estate. Apart from these connections, the life of Marie Antoinette continues to fascinate generations globally, a life characterized by ornate gowns, grand balls, and a sprawling estate, but also in treason, alleged affairs, imprisonment, and a grim execution. While the presence of Marie Antoinette was a prominent memory in their 1901 trip to Versailles, both Charlotte and Eleanor would soon learn the identity of another important figure. The estate of Versailles saw the likes of many high-ranking nobles, along with several servants and groundsmen to tend to the palace. One notable person that was recognized by both women included the mysterious, sinister man that was situated within the Chinese kiosk. Charlotte and Eleanor identified this man as the Count de Vaudreuil, known as Joseph Hyacinthe François de Paul de Rougon. The Count was formerly a member of King Louis XVI's royal court, and, allegedly, was said to be both a friend and rival to the late Marie Antoinette. As a man of mixed Creole heritage with several smallpox markings, his appearance matched their original encounter entirely. Examining the date of their original trip, Charlotte and Eleanor found another alarming connection to their experience. The date of their visit to Versailles, August 10th of 1901, was the 109th anniversary of the palace's insurrection, which allegedly occurred on August 10th of 1792. Historically, however, the attack actually occurred at the Tuileries Palace in Paris, not at Versailles. At this time, the Tuileries Palace was a temporary haven for King Louis, Marie Antoinette, their children, and the royal staff. Despite the royal family not being at Versailles on this particular date, August 10th of 1792 marked a huge shift in the revolution, entailing the monarchy's rapid descent. Reportedly, a French friend of Eleanor Jourdain made a fascinating claim. Allegedly, on a particular day in August at the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette could still be seen outside, along with several other nobles and palace staff members. Considering the siege of Tuileries Palace on August 10th of 1792, both Charlotte and Eleanor theorized that they had somehow accessed a vivid former memory of Marie Antoinette. Branching from this theory, the vision of her painting at the Petit Trianon Gardens, surrounded by her royal servants, may be explained by an emotional, spiritual imprint by the Queen herself, a lingering will of her former life at Versailles, while her present life remained in danger at Tuileries Palace. These eerie connections were hard to ignore, and before long, Charlotte and Eleanor would embark on a series of visits back to the gardens of Versailles, particularly surrounding the Petit Trianon. These trips would span over the course of 10 years, following their enigmatic experience in the year 1901. Among several trips both women took back to the estate, Eleanor Jourdain would record further unexplainable occurrences she experienced while on the property. One account from her visit on January 2nd, 1902, entails some eerie sights and encounters she recalled while crossing a bridge to the Queen's Hamlet. Upon crossing the bridge, Jourdain noted a strange sensation, stating, "It was as if I had crossed a line, and was suddenly in a circle of influence." Adding to this odd feeling, Eleanor noticed a pair of men wearing strange, brightly colored garments, consisting of red and blue tunics, capes, and hoods. They appeared to be moving a cart filled with twigs and branches, but upon looking away for a brief second, the two men were nowhere in sight. Eleanor then spotted another man. However, his appearance was fleeting and ghost-like. Following the man's disappearance, Eleanor was quickly engulfed in what felt like a crowd of people passing through her. She reportedly heard several voices speaking softly. However, their words were indiscernible. The mysterious crowd was then followed by the music and singing of a band, seemingly farther away in the gardens. However, Eleanor noticed that the band also had an unsettling quality to it. Eleanor describes the sounds of the band as follows. Both music and voices were diminished, as in a phonograph, unnaturally. The pitch of the band was lower than usual. To make matters even eerier, Eleanor eventually made her way back to the Petit Trianon to speak with one of the tour guides. She asked if a band was performing that day. However, she was surprised to hear that no such band was scheduled to play at the Petit Trianon or surrounding gardens. Despite more of these odd occurrences, Eleanor would have yet another strange sensation in 1908. Returning to the Petit Trianon once more, Eleanor witnessed two women arguing in the palace gardens. However, not long after, their voices seemed to fade away, and Eleanor noted a strange yet familiar experience. Her words are as follows: "Suddenly and utterly unexpectedly, I knew that some indefinable change had taken place. I felt as though I were being taken up into another condition of things. I turned at once to look back, and saw the gates near which they were sitting melting away, and the background of trees again becoming visible through them, as on our original visit. But I noticed that the side pillars were standing steady. The whole scene, sky, trees, and buildings, gave a little shiver, like the movement of a curtain or of scenery at a theater." Thankfully for Eleanor, the bizarre sensation would soon end as she continued her path through the estate. However, there was another alarming observation that Eleanor would soon share with Charlotte Moberly. Comparing their notes and recollections, both Charlotte and Eleanor pointed out a glaring anomaly, one that occurred on multiple occasions throughout their visits to Versailles. Reflecting upon their trips to the Petit Trianon and its surrounding gardens, the two women noted several missing features that no longer existed on the property. Most notably were the Chinese kiosk that no longer existed, as well as the bridge they had previously traversed that was nowhere to be found. Certain paths and distances within the garden seemed to change in length and placement. However, there was no official documentation of any changes or renovations to the palace grounds in all the years they had visited. Despite having no clear conclusion for the many strange events at the Petit Trianon, Charlotte and Eleanor were convinced that their encounters were in fact paranormal in nature. As a result, the two women attempted to share their experiences with the Society for Psychical Research, a recently formed organization in the United Kingdom that examined matters beyond established sciences. Unfortunately, Eleanor and Charlotte's efforts were in vain. The SPR denied the credibility of their experiences, allegedly from factual and historical inconsistencies. Furthermore, the SPR claimed that their recollections may have been tainted by flawed memories, making their case even less concrete. Regardless of the setback, Charlotte and Eleanor were determined to share their experiences with the world. In 1911, the two women would release a book entitled An Adventure, which documented all of the strange occurrences they had at the Petit Trianon and surrounding gardens from 1901 onward. The book even included maps of the estate, comparing the palace grounds from the archives to the alternate versions both Charlotte and Eleanor experienced while on their trips to Versailles. Originally published under false names, An Adventure would prove to be a success, selling 11,000 copies from 1911 to 1913. With a variety of accounts and research provided by Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, a looming question remains: what could explain all these eerie experiences within the gardens of the Petit Trianon? One of the proposed theories for Charlotte and Eleanor's accounts is that the two women experienced a vivid series of hauntings throughout the palace gardens. Theoretically, this could explain the appearances of deceased historical figures tied to the palace, their antiquated clothing, and the multiple brief encounters both women witnessed that seemed to vanish unnaturally. Additionally, both Charlotte and Eleanor originally surmised that their experiences were ghostly in nature. Despite some of these correlations, the theory that Charlotte and Eleanor experienced an elaborate series of hauntings is uncertain. The high number of spirits present, their detailed vocal interactions, and the changing environment of the Petit Trianon gardens are beyond typical haunting encounters. Examining the accounts shared by Charlotte and Eleanor, it is possible that both women experienced extensive cases of residual haunting. Coined by paranormal investigator Frederick W.H. Myers, a residual haunting is created from energy that is deeply ingrained into a location, often from a highly emotional event. This leaves what is sometimes called a psychic impression on a location, often marked by spirits who continue to manifest and/or perform the same actions repeatedly in that specific place. This would correlate to the events surrounding the Petit Trianon, with the seizing and eventual execution of France's last monarchs being a huge tie to the palace's eerie activity. Alarmingly, however, a residual haunting does not fully correlate with Charlotte and Eleanor's accounts. These hauntings normally repeat without influence from present events or interactions with the living. Eleanor's individual trips to the Petit Trianon, which included apparitions, disembodied voices, and distant music, do fit the criteria of a residual haunting. However, the repeated interactions of the spirits both women experienced on their 1901 trip do prove otherwise. In contrast, this provides some evidence towards an intelligent haunting, which occurs when spirits actively attempt communication with living individuals. Furthermore, this behavior is often tied to an emotional agenda that is keeping the spirit earthbound, and can even manifest in moving objects, opening and closing doors, odd sounds, and at times electrical interference. In the case of Charlotte and Eleanor, however, the presences they experienced did not appear to have any particular motive, apart from the seemingly ordinary activities they were performing in the garden. Apart from Eleanor's individual experiences, their voices were reportedly clear, like that of a living person. There were no signs of any objects or fixtures moving on their own, nor were there any disembodied sounds that the women identified during their 1901 visit. While the theory of a haunting at the Petit Trianon remains unclear, there is one theory that has gained extensive popularity. Based on the accounts provided by Charlotte and Eleanor, many theorize that the two women experienced a time slip at the Petit Trianon and the surrounding gardens of Versailles. Sometimes referred to as a temporal distortion, the occurrence of time slips throughout history has been a subject of interest and debate for many years, with Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain's experiences being the most famous possible example. Notable publications, including the New York Times and Psychology Today, have explored possible causes for time slips, along with several reported instances over the past few decades. Allegedly, some sources believe time slips occur as a result of the scientific multiverse theory. As a brief overview, this theory suggests that an infinite number of worlds or dimensions coexist. A major distinction, however, is that they exist along differing timelines, with a number of events and outcomes that contrast each other. Branching from this theory, it is believed that time slips can occur when parallel universes overlap, resulting in accidental breaks. Others theorize that time slips can form from tears in the time-space continuum, possibly from abnormal gravitational and/or electromagnetic occurrences. Unfortunately, these theories are difficult to prove, but remain relevant in the study of time slips and possible time travel phenomena. Alarmingly, reported time slip experiences have been occurring more rapidly in the past few decades. Beyond Charlotte and Eleanor's experiences in France, alleged time slips have also occurred throughout the globe, with frequent cases reported in the United States and across Europe. Less than 50 years after the Moberly Jourdain Incident, a woman by the name of E.F. Smith experienced an odd occurrence after leaving a cocktail party in Scotland on January 2, 1950. Accompanied by her dog, Smith was driving in an area roughly close to the small Scottish village of 𝗧𝗛𝗓𝗏 when the weather became noticeably turbulent. Troubled by an unfortunate combination of snow and rain, Smith drove into a nearby ditch. However, she retained consciousness throughout the accident, and was fortunately not injured by the crash. Despite the darkness and inclement weather, Smith was left with no other choice but to walk down the road, holding her dog as she approached an area known as 𝗪𝗔𝗡𝗏. The area, which was mostly a rural countryside with farms and scattered buildings, was suddenly lit by a strange party that seemed to appear from nowhere. Smith noticed 3 groups of men carrying torches that burned a bright red. However, their clothes were oddly antiquated. Judging from their tunics, boots, and tights, they appeared to be dressed in attire from the Middle Ages. More alarmingly, however, the men seemed to be inspecting lifeless bodies throughout the hill, turning them over for a closer look. Upon doing further research into the area's history, Miss Smith was convinced that she had experienced some sort of time anomaly, one that showed her the aftermath of the Battle of 𝗪𝗔𝗧𝗖𝗛𝗡𝗏. The strange men who inspected the bodies were identified by Miss Smith as the Picts, a group of people led by King 𝗪𝗔𝗧𝗖𝗛, who defeated the invading Northumbrians in a crucial 650 AD battle. While no further witnesses confirmed seeing the torch-bearing men or the scattered bodies, locals confirmed that the Battle of 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗖𝗛𝗡 did occur at 𝗪𝗔𝗡𝗏. Furthermore, Miss Smith noted that the men she saw that night seemed to stay farther along the edges of the field as they traversed it. It was later revealed that a small lake had once existed in the field centuries prior, which explained the positioning and movements of the mysterious men. These details further point to Miss Smith's experience being some sort of accidental time slip, although no further reports have been made in this area of Scotland. Additionally, one of the world's most famous alleged time slips is the Bold Street Incident, which occurred in Liverpool, England on July of 1996. An off-duty police officer by the name of Frank was shopping with his wife Carol on Bold Street when a strange event soon unfolded. Carol had reportedly entered a store named Dillon's Bookshop to browse their selections, while her husband Frank departed to Ranelagh Street to shop in a nearby music store. However, after trying to rejoin his wife 20 minutes later, Frank was met with a puzzling sight. Apart from the uneasy silence around him, all of the pedestrians in his vicinity wore old clothing, seemingly from the 1950s. Most alarmingly, however, was the shop sign. What was Dylan's bookshop was now a store named Cripps. Gone were the books on the display, which were now replaced with women's shoes and accessories. Shortly after seeing this odd sight, Frank would then see a young woman dressed in modern clothes from the 1990s. She attempted to enter the shop, but became noticeably confused. In an instant, the odd scene that both Frank and the young woman experienced would seemingly disappear, reverting the Cripps storefront and the 1950s pedestrians into the then-present Bold Street, featuring Dylan's bookshop. Both Frank and the young woman confirmed their shared experiences with an unexplainable shift in reality. To their shock, they later discovered that a Cripps clothing store once stood in place of the current Dylan's bookshop back in the 1950s. Apart from this particular incident, this area of Liverpool has been home to several more time-slip encounters, which have been reported by multiple visitors in the past couple decades. Examining the accounts of Charlotte and Eleanor, the time slip they experienced may have theoretically taken them to a familiar dimension, but along an older timeline. Based on their research and observations, this would point to a date before the Versailles Palace was overtaken during the French Revolution. Supporting this possibility were the historic figures the two women reportedly encountered, as well as the unique structures in the garden that had not existed after 1789. More specifically, these included the Chinese kiosk and the additional bridge the two women recalled from their visits, which were completely unaccounted for in later trips. The experiences of disappearing individuals, disembodied voices, and temporal distortions in their environment further align with previous reports of time slips in other areas of the world. Despite the many fascinating and mysterious experiences of both Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, their intriguing tale of possible time travel has been met with much skepticism. In fact, when their novel entitled An Adventure was released, both Charlotte and Eleanor originally published under pen names in order to conceal their identities. While both women held firmly to the truth and validity of their accounts, both Charlotte and Eleanor were aware that their reports would be subject to criticism and even potential mockery. Unfortunately, both women would experience many strong denials from individuals across the academic and professional sphere. One such individual was actually a former student by the name of Lucille Ironmonger, who published a work entitled Ghosts of Versailles, Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain and Their Adventure, a Critical Study. Lucille insinuated that both Charlotte and Eleanor were engaged in a romantic relationship, and while exploring the Versailles estate, experienced what was known as a shared delusion, or folie à deux. Additionally, another former student by the name of Joan Evans attempted to explain Charlotte and Eleanor's experiences in a different light. Departing from the idea of time travel or ghostly apparitions, Joan proposed that the two women experienced a tableau vivant performance. In other words, both women encountered an elaborate historical reenactment at the palace, with actors and staging designed to reflect the Rococo era of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's reign. This theory was most notably supported by historian Philippe Julien, who documented the life of an affluent French poet by the name of Robert de Montesquieu. Robert reportedly lived in an apartment on or near the Versailles estate, and was known to throw thematic parties with guests dressing as different characters and historical figures. Given the notable individuals of Versailles, including Marie Antoinette and the Count of Vaudreuil, it is plausible that both Charlotte and Eleanor may have inadvertently crashed one of Robert's events. Apart from multiple sources denouncing Charlotte and Eleanor's claims, the validity of their stories was countered with more arguments discrediting the memories and mental states of both women. Some sources claimed that Charlotte and Eleanor shared contradicting reports of their 1901 trip, with many alleged sightings that did not match up. This included the young woman in the cottage window of Marie Antoinette's Hamlet, which was seen by Charlotte and not Eleanor. Likewise, the apparition of what appeared to be Marie Antoinette drawing near the Petit Trianon was allegedly only seen by Charlotte, with Eleanor unable to recall this encounter. Further investigations revealed that both women individually experienced questionable paranormal and/or hallucinatory phenomenon in their respective pasts, although this claim is up for debate. Despite many of the counterclaims shared by critics, the Moberly Jourdain incident still holds many viable pieces of evidence that warrant closer inspection. How could Charlotte and Eleanor see both a bridge and a Chinese kiosk, which did not exist in the Versailles Gardens at the time of their visit, yet did exist at the time of France's monarchy? Likewise, how could they experience both an orchestra and an elaborate historical reenactment when neither were accounted for on the days of their respective visits? Furthermore, the strange emotional auras experienced by Charlotte, as well as the concerning apparitions and environmental distortions witnessed by Eleanor, provide more eerie clues to support a paranormal occurrence. These reports mirror many of the same occurrences described in more modern accounts of time slips, including the Battle of Nectansmere sighting in 1950 Scotland, as well as the 1996 Bold Street anomaly in Liverpool, England. Looking beyond their Versailles encounters, the case for Charlotte and Eleanor creating an elaborate hoax or recalling a shared hallucination remains weak. Both women did not have any known physical or mental ailments that could explain their bizarre experiences, nor were they under the influence of any substances. Furthermore, given their high titles in an academic institution, it would be highly unlikely for Charlotte and Eleanor to publish their experiences in efforts to gain publicity, while knowing that their reports will be met with heavy skepticism and potentially jeopardize their careers. Fortunately, despite the mixed reactions to their mysterious experiences at Versailles, both Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain continued their work in education. Charlotte retired at age 69, passing on her role and legacy as principal to her successor, Eleanor Jourdain. It is said that both women remained as lifelong friends, living together for an extended period of time and enjoying a shared vacation home. Unfortunately, Eleanor would pass away from a heart condition in 1924, living to the age of 61. Charlotte would pass away years later in 1937 at age 90, presumably from natural causes. While the explanation for the Moberly Jourdain incident remains unclear, the accounts shared by Charlotte and Eleanor have fascinated readers and researchers for well over a century. Their story continues to spark debate among enthusiasts and experts alike, ranging from highly vivid hauntings to the eerie possibility of a time slip back into history. Regardless of whether their reports are fact or fiction, the odd occurrences at Versailles and the Petit Trianon Gardens will continue to be one of France's greatest mysteries. Alright guys, and that is a wrap on the Moberly Jourdain incident in Versailles, France. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed this extended episode of Real Lore, and of course learning about all the mysteries surrounding the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette, and the supposedly haunted gardens. Speaking to the build itself, I do want to say that the lot is fairly historically accurate. I did have the pleasure of locating true floor plans to the Petit Trianon and was able to recreate a lot of the spaces seen there. But of course, I do use a little bit of creative liberty as well. With that said, this is still a no CC, no mod, limited pack build, and will be available on the Sims 4 gallery for download. I'll leave you guys now with the final lot specs, along with the final cinematic shots, so you can see how everything turned out in the end. And of course, just like always, this has been 𝗧𝗛𝗓𝗏𝗡𝗚 signing off. Thank you so much for watching, guys.